Zechariah chapter 5. We're going only to be in verses 1 through 4 because that's the next vision. If you can see over here on the board, this the chiastic structure, the way that Zechariah is broken down, where it has the visions, the 8 night visions in this kind of format. We're in the kind of B over here again with the 6th vision. And this vision is one of the flying scroll. And so you'll remember last time we finished off with kind of the center of the visionary content with chapter 3, which was the cleansing of Joshua, the high priest, that even the high priest of Israel needs a greater high priest to cleanse him, justify him, bring Israel and by extension the world into a right relationship with God, that they need to be cleansed and given righteousness to be able to fulfill their role as the kingdom of priests. And in Zechariah chapter 4, for Israel to be that light to the nations, they needed the kind of two to become one. They needed the kingly aspect of the temple theology to be fulfilled so that Israel could be that kingdom of priests, and that this would be fulfilled in Zerubbabel. And so you have these kind of the two becoming one and being able to fulfill Israel's role as a light to the world, which would be fulfilled in Messiah, who represents Israel in that capacity. Now we kind of fan back out to not the center, but moving out again. And vision 3 and 6 correspond. They have similar themes of national issues. They focus on national things going on with Israel. What does the kind of macro perspective of Israel as a nation, what's going to happen and what's going on? And we've seen very hopeful things. By the way, the vision that corresponds with this is in chapter 2. We've seen very hopeful pictures so far. The visions have all been about Israel's great hope and future. But there are some conditions, and there's a text of warning here. And so in Zechariah 5, we start to see what needs to happen with the nation as a whole. And so in verses 1 and 2, we'll see what the vision was. The vision is fairly simple. And then in verses 3 and 4, we'll see what the vision means. And so as this turn here takes place to this stern warning, we see that there are some requirements that God puts on his people in order for these things to take place. But let me read just the passage in its entirety. It's pretty short. Zechariah 5, 1 through 4. Then I lifted up my eyes again, and behold, there was a flying scroll. And he said to me, "What do you see?" And I answered, "I see a flying scroll. Its length is 20 cubits, and its width 10 cubits. Then he said to me, "This is the curse going forth over the face of the whole land," or the whole earth. "Surely everyone who steals will be purged away according to the writing on the one side, and everyone who swears will be purged away according to the writing on the other side. I will make it go forth, declares the Lord, and it will enter the house of the thief and the house of the one who swears falsely by my name, and it will spend the night within that house and consume it with its timber and stones." Take a sip of my tea. So the vision here is fairly simple. It's not actually too hard to picture, but by the way, like last week, I uploaded some images to go along with this to kind of help us picture this scroll on just above or below this post of this Sunday school video. So Zechariah sees a flying scroll. In Hebrew, a Megillah, the Megillah, this large scroll that is, and by the way, This is unprecedented. Even the Isaiah scroll that they found several years ago in the Qumran community that preserved this ancient text of Isaiah, it unfurls, and it's very, very long, but it's not quite as long as this. This scroll is 20 cubits by 10 cubits. So the length of it is 20 cubits by 10. And so what this means, working out a cubit, so let's say this is the 20 cubits, which that comes out to about 30 feet. So imagine a tarp that lays out about 30 feet by 10 cubits, which is about 15 feet. So this scroll, with writing on both sides, is flying through the air. And so you can imagine the picture of this. Think of sort of like a billboard that is going through where you live. And on each side, it has what you have violated in your contract. It has the two main areas of disobedience during that time. And in particular, what is pointed out here are one who steals and one who swears falsely by God's name. Now, there's some other important factors here. What he's seeing, this flying scroll represents the law and the curse, and we'll see all that. But the dimensions are important. The dimensions, the 20 cubits by the 10 cubits. If you actually look up, and thankfully a lot of people have done this before us and have noticed these things before us, so we can kind of stand on their shoulders. And that's very helpful in Bible study, is have other people made these observations previously. If you look up the dimensions, 20 cubits and 10 cubits, just those words, you can do it on Bible Gateway, which is very simple Bible software. What you will find is a few passages, but these dimensions match the dimensions of the tabernacle in Exodus 26, 15 through 25, where God's presence was supposed to be, the same dimensions there. But also, in 1 Kings 6, 3, they match the dimensions of the temple. So this shares the same dimensions as the entryway, the porch to the temple. So remember, temple theology has been a big part of Zechariah. Let me read 1 Kings 6, 3. Speaking about the temple, it says, "The porch in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits in its length, corresponding to the width of the house, and its depth along the front of the house was 10 cubits. So we've got 20 by 10. And so that recognition of that number in regard to this flying scroll would have brought into people's minds the porch of Solomon's temple, the entrance to temple theology. And to kind of get into the temple, you have to pass through the law. And that's kind of what the idea is, that there's a requirement at the gate. There's a condition that must be passed. Also, the entryway to the temple is the precinct where the judicial processes would take place. It talks about this in 1 Kings 8, 31 and 32. That this is where judgment would often take place, would be in this entryway of the temple. So when this flying scroll is going through the land, and it has the dimensions of the entryway to the temple, it's a reminder to the people that there's a requirement, there's a condition on them to obey and participate in temple theology, and there's a problem. They have disobeyed God's laws in an overall sense. James 2:10, if you break one commandment, you're guilty of breaking the whole law. But in some particular points, that there have been some particular specific violations that have taken place in the violation of God's law that is preventing the blessings that could take place that Zechariah has promised. That though they have been brought back to the land, Israel, the Jews, had not truly, fully returned to their obligations in the covenant that they had with God. That they had returned back, many of them, not a huge number, a little less than I think 50,000 at one point in reading in Ezra and Nehemiah, have come back to the land. But they've neglected the most important aspect of temple theology. They have not built the temple. So they have come back, used their time, materials, everything that God has given them to kind of live their own lives, live their own plan, and not follow the instructions that God had given them in regard to building the temple, to being what God was calling them to be as his kingdom of priests in that land. That they had dropped the ball in regard to Zechariah chapter 3, the priesthood. That they're supposed to be this priestly nation to the rest of the world. The rest of the world also looks at them as the light of the nations, and they haven't done that either. They can't be the kingdom. And they're, to be fair to them, they are meeting with for about 15 years. That this is why they have a pause on building the temple. They meet with opposition to build the temple. They're still commanded to do it, but then they meet with opposition and it stops. And the main sin of this time, as I've said before, is not idolatry in the sense that Israel is seeking other gods in a direct way, or apostasy. It is worldliness in that they become very comfortable in their time and they forget what the unique role that God had called them to, and they forget their role in what God's doing to accomplish the end. They don't really believe in many cases that the end that Zechariah and the other prophets have said is really going to happen. And so God sends Haggai, he sends Zechariah to say, it does matter what you do, because you are participating in what will be the steps to lead to this ultimate goal. For example, let me give a New Testament example. Paul's theology in 1 Corinthians 15, talking about the resurrection, the centrality of the resurrection, that if the resurrection did not happen, we're, of all people, most to be pitied. And this is not a, Pascal's wager. Some Christians think it's cute to post on Facebook that, oh, well, at least if none of this is real, I lived with hope. That's not the apologetic Jesus or Paul or Peter or any of the apostles or Isaiah or Zechariah or Moses ever use. They don't say, well, if none of this is real, then I don't, at least I lived as a good person with hope. That's not what is being said. Paul says that if none of this is real, we are liars. We have lied against God. And he uses that theoretical impossible. We talk about knowing. We talk about that confidence in the truth. Not some sort of wager that, well, this is something I pretend to believe so that I feel better. That's not a biblical hope. But Paul talks about at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, well, if all this is true of the resurrection, and we have this great future hope, what is the application? And it is in 1 Corinthians 15, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, in the hope of the Lord. So it has, that theology comes into the present, that hope in the future comes into present and demands that obedience. Often where we struggle with obedience is not just do this or don't do that. It's knowing why and knowing what the hope is of the future. In talking about sanctification, 1 Thessalonians 4, it talks about it in the context of the return of Christ gloriously to be with his people and his holiness and all that that's going to entail. And then it says, what is the will of God for you? This is the will of God, your sanctification. That is how we bring the future into the present. That we participate in that hope of the future in the present through our obedience. And it's harder to obey if you don't have a hope in the future. And that's what the Jews in this time were experiencing. That's why God graciously sent them Haggai, sent them Zechariah. And even in this time, they still don't fully obey. But there is a remnant that does build the temple. But it's just like if we or any other people were there, there is a lack of full obedience that needs to be remedied. And we'll see that in a little bit. But visualizing all the data here, we see a gigantic scroll of the law that's unfurled, that flies over the land, visible for all to see. So this brings out, it's very prominent, it's very open, the scroll is unwrapped, it's like I said, a billboard, it's meant to be seen on purpose, it's flying. This probably indicates that its origin is from God, that it applies also to everybody. Everybody sees it and has an accountability from it. And so this giant scroll that has these dimensions of the temple has some problems, presents some problems. So what does this mean? Verses 3 and 4. So we've seen what the vision is, the visionary content. But what does the vision mean? It says, let me read verse 3. Then he said to me, this is the curse that is going forth over the whole land, or really the earth. The word there, the Hebrew word, land. Yes, it refers to the general land that they're in a sense, but also it refers in a broader sense, the whole earth. Now, only Israel is God's covenant people at this time that have agreed to covenant obedience to him in a unique way. So God holds them accountable with this scroll. But it says this is the curse that is going forth in the whole land. The law, the scroll, is called the curse. And this curse refers to the idea in the Old Testament. You see this especially in places like Deuteronomy. You see it in Leviticus too, but in the law as well. I think particularly of places like Deuteronomy 29. Talks about, and Zechariah has alluded to this in Zechariah chapter 1 as well, talks about that this idea of the overtaking, that when something like chases down and catches something, that the law said, places like Deuteronomy 29, that if you obeyed, blessing would come and overtake you. That blessing would catch up and it would get you and it would overwhelm you. And that's so very simple kind of way of putting it, that obedience equals blessing. Okay, not individual salvation, but obedience would bring this national blessing to Israel uniquely, and allow them to be that kind of replacement of Adam as God's son, that kind of return to Eden. It would kind of reverse the curse within their land and have these blessings. And then this would impact the rest of the world. If they could do it, then the rest of the world would come to them and come to the God of Israel through them. And so they would have all these blessings if they obeyed. And disobedience will go to curse. Now, the problem is, New Covenant Christians often view this as our rule. And there is some warrant for that. I'm not denying that if you live a certain way, that there are consequences that will happen in a positive or negative way. That you read the book of Proverbs, that there is a way that the world is built, that hard work tends to you living a better life. Honesty tends to you living a better life. Okay, that's true. That's not always true, but it tends to be true. But often we take this as, if I obey God, that will bring blessing. And that's not true. That's in that ultimate sense. And in fact, it can even become heretical. And I'll point that out in a second too. Obedience was the requirement for them to be blessed. But Israel could never do it because they were sinners, because they did not have that heart to obey God, to have God's Spirit within them, that resurrected them spiritually from the dead, to make them walk in God's ways, to put God's law in their heart, and cause them to know the Lord and to obey His ways. And so, Moses, even in Deuteronomy, talks about this, that yes, these would be the results if you obeyed, but it's not really going to be relevant because it's rarely, if ever, going to happen. It may happen for a little while, but it's always going to break down because of human sinfulness. And so Moses spends most of his time talking about the curses of the law that will ultimately culminate in exile. That exile is what will finally take place when Israel, as God's covenant people, have disobeyed Him to the extent that the curses have all fallen on them and they have not repented, and God finally has forces come, foreign Gentile forces come and push them out of the land. And this finally did happen as well. And with Judah, it happened 587, 586 BC, and it lasted for 70 years. Now, after 70 years, Cyrus, 539, 538, allows and decrees for the Jews to go back to the land. Allows them materials and things to build the temple. And there are people who want to go back. There's Sheshbazzar, there's Ezra, there's Nehemiah over time. These are different time periods. There's Joshua, there's Zerubbabel, there's the 50,000 or so went back. But not many of them do. Many of them stay in Babylon. And Babylon stays in many of them. Meaning, even though they returned to the land, a lot of them brought the worldliness with them. That it was, they gave lip service to God, to God's work in the world, but they were just interested in living their best life now. They were interested in having kind of a religion of worship to God, the one true God of Israel, and kind of saying, oh, well, I wish these things of the prophets could be true, but it doesn't look like it's going to pan out. but also doing their own thing. And this was the worldliness that was the struggle for Israel during this time. And so even though they had been brought back to their land, this flying scroll that Zechariah talks about warns them sternly that these curses can happen again. That it can take place again. And ultimately it does. Remember 70 AD, the temple gets destroyed and is never rebuilt to this day. And so what ultimately ends up happening is really only this. And you can see this in the Kings too. Solomon, great king in many ways, but we see a glimpse of his obedience and the obedience of people leading to blessing, and then his sin, his disobedience, enters the picture, and it brings about the curse. And as that cycle continues, it finally brings about the curse until exile. And so even though they were back in the land, Zechariah and Haggai are warning them again, this can still take place. And so they warn them against this. And let me draw something here. So here are the promises, the future promises that Zechariah has made in Zechariah chapters, we'll just say generally, 1 through 4. Problem is, here's Israel. The link here is supposed to be obedience, but they don't have it in that full sense. So there's a disconnect between Israel and the future eschatological promises. Now God has made very clear, this is going to happen. So the question is not what, it's how. How is this going to take place? And we'll save that for a little bit later, but let's get a little bit more specific here of what's going on. So we see that this is flying through the land announcing the verdict of a curse on the people. Let me read, it's also double-sided. This is a two-sided scroll. It's kind of unusual because it's difficult to create, but it also represents the law. Listen to Exodus 32:15. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand. The tablets were written on both sides. They were written on one side and the other. So, and by the way, some people think that commandments 1 through 10 were on one tablet, commandments 6 through, what did I say, 1 through 10? 1 through 5 and then 6 through 10. What it really is 2 copies. It's one copy for God and one copy for the people. It's a carbon copy, sort of like when you sign something that you both have a copy of the covenant. You both have a copy of the contract. You're supposed to understand both sides. Your obligations. Now God had fulfilled his obligations. He had done everything above and beyond. He had created Israel as a unique people. He had brought them out of Egypt. He had preserved them, all this stuff. Now, even though he'd brought them into exile, he'd also allowed for them to be brought back to the land. God's end of the covenant had been more than kept. God had been more than merciful to them. Now it was Israel's side to keep the covenant. But they haven't. Instead of blessings, they're experiencing curses. And this points out in 2 particular areas of law violation: theft and swearing falsely by God's name. Theft and swearing falsely by God's name. Now, there's a lot of thought that is helpful in thinking why these 2 violations. One helpful understanding is these are the two kind of tables of the law that have, one is more relation to God, one is more relation to man. Okay, fair enough. They're also very central. They're the central commandments of the two tables. So this is the idea that it really is a sample of the whole law, both sides of the whole law. That is true as well. But we can't ignore the fact that it points out these two particular violations. So we'll put up here theft and swearing, not cuss words, swearing, but swearing falsely, taking God's name in vain. Now, why these two? Well, let me read, just to give you the references for these. Exodus 20:15, very simple, you shall not steal. And that has more particular applications throughout the law and ways of what theft looks like and all sorts of things of that nature. But also Exodus 20 verse 7, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Now this doesn't just mean saying God's name in an irreverent way, though that would be an application that is definitely included. This is swearing falsely by the name of the Lord, making an oath that is false. But let me give kind of an example, a parable, if you will, of how these two commandments came into play. Let's say that someone made a contract, an agreement. Just do stick figures here. I don't know if you can see this, but you can imagine. Okay, one person and another person have an agreement. This person provides to this person money, material, time, and the requirement of their agreement, their contract, is this person will provide all of these things, and this person is to take these things and to build a house for this person. Person B agrees to the contract. But person B takes the time, money, energy, and materials and breaches the contract, ignores what the person A, what he agreed with person A to do, and instead takes what person A gave him and builds himself a house and takes care of himself. This is a form of theft, and it's a form of violation of an agreement, swearing falsely. This is, in a human-to-human way, what the Jews had done to God. God had allowed them to return to the land. God had changed world history to bring about Cyrus and to bring about these kingdoms, and the way that he did, that Cyrus would be a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy over 100 years before, and that Cyrus had a different way of ruling, and that he brought him about. And Cyrus even knows and is aware that the Lord has chosen him to be this instrument to bring the people back into the land, to allow them to return. And it even says in Ezra 1:1-4, and at the end of 2 Chronicles, same wording really, that God stirred up the spirit of Cyrus to allow the Jews to return to the land. And he gives this decree. And people go back. A lot of people don't go back. But the people who do, they go there and they start to build, and the foundation of God's house is laid. That's good. But then they meet opposition. And to be fair to them, this is a very fearful time. Why have this opposition? Just avoid building the temple. Just wait for a better time. So they took the materials and they built themselves houses. And they ignored what God had sent them there to do. And so, the judgment that is on them now, the curse that is on them now, God points out this flying scroll, this billboard for everybody to see and know of the law, the curse going throughout the whole land: theft, swearing falsely by my name. They're acting like they're the covenant people of God, but ignoring the instructions of God. Swearing falsely by his name. And then they're taking what he gave them and using it for themselves. And that's very applicable to us today, even though our job is not to build a physical temple. But these are things that we ought to consider, that in our temptation toward worldliness in our time. Let me read some scriptures relevant from the time. Nehemiah 13:10. It's a little later than the time of Zechariah, but still relevant. I also discovered that the portions of the Levites, these priests, had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed service had gone away, each to his own field. The people were supposed to pay a tithe and pay for the spiritual leadership to provide for them to do their service. They weren't doing it. Even at the end of Nehemiah, there's still these problems. Malachi 3:8. God says, "Will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me." Well, how could you rob God? But you say, "How have we robbed you?" God answers, "In tithes and offerings." As the people of God, they were required to participate in giving to the theocracy, giving to the spiritual leadership in order to facilitate their role as God's people. Now, this was not enforced, by the way, by the state. This was enforced by God. This was supposed to be what they were giving to God out of their obedience to him. But it wasn't happening. And Malachi is kind of a panorama of the post-exilic period. That it shows that the Old Testament is a bad ending, in need of resolution. And there would be a demand for a new covenant, which would come with new scriptures, written documents that would explain the resolution and the new event, the new paradigm that would take place. And so theft and swearing falsely are the sins that God kind of puts his fingers on and points out to Israel. Let me read a contemporary of Zechariah, the older prophet, and the shorter prophet in his time, Haggai. Haggai comes and preaches, and he's a lot simpler, a lot more direct, a lot less detail, and he's older. There's some thought that Haggai might have been around long enough to see the previous temple, the Solomonic temple, in its glory, because he comes back and says, "Hey, remember the temple? I do too, and this is nothing even close." But Haggai comes and he preaches fairly simply. And then Zechariah is kind of an unfolding of how the promises of Haggai, how they're going to take place in Messiah. So Zechariah gives a lot more detail, and he's the younger guy. But let me read Haggai chapter 1, some verses from here. In the second year of Darius, the king. Okay, so this is very much in the age of the Gentiles, in that sense of they identify the year by a Gentile king. On the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel. So remember, Zerubbabel is that descendant of David, that he's supposed to be responsible for rebuilding the temple and will complete the work. But he's not a king. To Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. So we've got the civil ruler, Zerubbabel, and we've got the religious ruler in Joshua. What does the word of the Lord say? Thus says the Lord of hosts, this people says, the time has not come, even the time for the house of God to be rebuilt. So, to deal with the fact that they were disobeying God, people of this time came up with, because nobody just says, I'm disobeying God. Rarely, if ever. In fact, that might almost be refreshing if somebody who just said, I prefer to disobey God. I know fully what I am doing, and I'm doing. Now that would be high-handed, I admit, but often we come up with in the deceitfulness of sin, to self-deceive, to trick ourselves, we come up with some sort of inner monologue narrative, something that we say that has some sort of surface validity to it, that will be a good enough answer that sounds spiritual enough, but kind of is enough that we don't have to obey God, but that we can look like we want to obey God. So right in that sweet spot. And so what are they saying during this time? In Haggai 1:2, this people says, the time has not come, even the time for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. It's not God's timing. Timing's not there. We don't want to presume upon God's timing. But God's told them to do something. Yeah, well, God's over time. It's not our goal to question God. And see, you could make it sound biblical, right? Mr. Moore taught a few weeks ago, James, if the Lord wills, right? That's the biblical way of saying that. But often, in the twistedness of sin, people will take certain principles and use them as an excuse to disobey God. And in this case, they'd say, the time hasn't come. And so the Lord is saying through Haggai the prophet, people keep saying this, the time has not come. Then the prophet said, verse 3 of Haggai 1, the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, is it time for you, yourselves, to dwell in paneled houses, while this house lies desolate? Now, Haggai's going to, I understand, he goes to Joshua, he goes to Zerubbabel and preaches to them, and presumably to the whole people. But I almost imagine Haggai as kind of a door-to-door prophet. That he knocks on, it's not time to rebuild, it's not God's timing. Okay. And he goes and knocks on their door, and if they don't hide behind the couch, they come out. He says, hi, I'm Haggai. Just kidding. But he says, well, this is a pretty nice house. I like the wood paneling. It's the 70s or something. And he has the wood paneling. Well, so what about God's house? Oh, it's not time. You guys always, it's not time to rebuild God's house. He goes, really? So it's time to build your house with all the materials God gave you, but it's not, while God's house lies desolate. Does that seem to be consistent with you? That it's time to build your house, is what you really mean. So he really turns it around in a very simple way on them. Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house, God's house, lies desolate? Now therefore, thus says the Lord, consider your ways. You have sown much, but harvest little. There's a famine. There's a food shortage, which is a curse of the law. You eat, but there is not enough to be satisfied. You drink, but there is not enough to become drunk. You put on clothing, but no one is warm enough. And he who earns wages puts them into a purse with holes. If you have a purse with holes in it, imagine putting your paycheck or the cash you just got paid, and you walked home, and you get there and you realize half of it has fallen out. There's a curses of the law that are on the land. God is not allowing them the blessings to prosper because they've disobeyed him. They've allowed God's house to remain desolate. Listen at Haggai 1 as it goes further. Thus says the Lord God of hosts, consider your ways, go up to the mountains, bring wood, and rebuild the temple, that I may be pleased with it and be glorified, says the Lord. You look for much, but behold, it becomes little. When you bring it home, I blow it away. Why? Declares the Lord God of hosts, because my house lies desolate, while each of you runs to his own house. Therefore, because of you, the sky has withheld its dew, and the earth withheld its produce. I called for a drought on the land, on the mountains, and on the grain, the new wine, the oil, what the ground produces, on men, on cattle, on the labor of your hands. And so the response of Zerubbabel, of Joshua, of others, is they go and they quickly get back to work and rebuild the temple. Now, remember, we've been talking about temple theology, and Israel was hearing all these great promises from Zechariah about temple theology, but they were missing the very center of temple theology, the temple. They didn't have the temple. And so he's encouraging them, go build the temple, because Messiah is going to come and fulfill temple theology. And your obedience in this time, in this small way, participates in the ultimate future promises. Because the connecting point will be Messiah will come and he will fulfill those things. Now, it was seen to be impossible. But they said, remember, Zechariah is going to come. He's going to finish the temple. He's going to put on the final top stone of the temple. And then in Zechariah 4:9, the Lord says, the suffering servant says, then you will know that the Lord has sent me to you, that the Messiah is on his way when Zerubbabel finishes the temple. And so there's this requirement that is lacking in their time because they haven't built the temple. And there's this threat that their disobedience could be their undoing again. So what is God going to do? How is God going to deal with this? Look at verse 4 of Zechariah chapter 5. I will make it go forth. Well, actually, let me start in verse 3 again. It talks about everyone who steals will be purged away. Everyone who swears will be purged away. Verse 4, I will make it go forth, the curse, declares the Lord of hosts, and it will enter the house of the thief and the house of the one who swears falsely by my name, and it will spend the night within that house and consume it with its timber and stones. Now, God's curse here is because they've done this. What he's going to do in his judgment is the curse is going to come home. And it's going to spend the night. And the curse is going to stay there for as long as it takes until this house is destroyed. And they focus on, instead, building up God's house. Now it may seem, well, that's kind of hard. The curse follows them home and does this. But what God's purpose in this, even though it is a curse, even though it is a judgment, the goal is to purge out the worldliness, the hope in other things, the removal of their focus on the things of this world, so that their only hope rests in God and their confident expectation of what he is going to bring in the future. One of the problems that I think we often share with the people of this time is a temptation to be very comfortable in this time now. Now, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with comfort, or that you should sleep on the floor instead of your bed, or not turn on the air conditioning, or not, that there should be this any type of like monastic type of purposely trying to get some discomfort so that you can be more godly. What I'm talking about is a tendency that we have to be very comfortable in the world and world system around us, enjoying these things to an extent where we're not sad, we don't mourn appropriately, that makes us long for the greater promises of the future. We can become so relaxed in the current system that we enjoy that we don't really care that this future kingdom of God has not arrived yet, that we don't get to participate in it yet, and that we don't long for it. If we were to choose between being there now and here now, which one would we choose? And often we very understandably would choose to be here. It's what we know. It's what we're comfortable with. But what God does in Zechariah, and does to deal with this, is he takes away those other things in which people find their comfort and their hope and their trust in, so that our hope is in the future. Our confident expectation is in the future of what God is going to do. And maybe even be applicable now, as we've seen these changes take place rapidly, that what once comforted us may not even be available right now. And again, America is not a people in covenant with God, as Israel's theocracy was. But a lot of these things do apply to us in the church today, because us in the church today, we do embody temple theology. We are supposed to be the temple. And I'll finish up with that in just a minute in 1 Peter. But notice the correspondence of God's judgment. If you look at Zechariah 5:4, what word is repeated? Let me read it again. Zechariah 5:4. I will make it go forth, declares the Lord of hosts, and it will enter the house of the thief and the house of him who swears falsely, and it will spend the night within the house and consume it with its timber and stones. 3 times, at least from my count, the word house is used. because they neglected God's house and they were hoping in their own houses, God was going to make a judgment against their houses. And so while the realities of temple theology as described in places in Zechariah were supposed to be embodied in Israel, they're supposed to be a kingdom of priests. They're missing the temple, God's house. You can't be a kingdom of priests without the temple. And so they're missing that. And they fail also, if they don't have that, to be that beacon, that light to the nations, that testimony to the nations. Now let me return to this tension. The obedience brings blessing, disobedience brings curse. This is a tension that cannot be resolved in sinners just trying to be obedient. Because the nature of sin is such that that will never take place. Not that it cannot. The parts are there that were that to happen, it could work, but it would never happen because that is not the nature of the sinner. And so this curse is stuck. And so the connecting point here is, as I said, in Messiah. Because Messiah comes, fulfills temple theology, and is the connecting point between the disobedience of his people and the future promises. Here's why. Disobedience brought curse. Obedience brings blessing. The Messiah, if he's able to be totally obedient to the law of God, he owns and participates in and takes over, if you will, corners the market on the blessings that come from obedience. And curse, Messiah will be the offerer, the priest, and the sacrifice. And if you think about places like Galatians 3:10 and 13, Galatians 3:10 quotes Deuteronomy that everyone who is under the works of the law is under a curse because we always disobey. We're sinners. That's the nature of sinners, is disobedience. And therefore curses can only be produced. That being said, Galatians 3:13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. As it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. That as that king and as the priest, he took on himself and undid the curse of the law. The curse of the law in Jesus is now eliminated. And union with him in temple theology means that only blessing can result. Now, why I said that this, if we keep this paradigm, it is heretical, is because that's what the book of Galatians is about. They said you needed Christ for salvation, but they said that to receive the blessings of God, Christ would save his people, but to receive the blessings of God, you had to keep the law. You had to be circumcised. And Paul says, you've missed the whole point. That Christ took on the curse of the law. Only blessing can result. So if you are trying to keep the law in order to have God bless you after you get saved, and that the blessings of God come to you because of your obedience after Christ has saved you, Christ is of no value to you. Because he is not, you've undone this whole paradigm. That Christ has brought in the blessings of obedience in himself and undone the curses of the law. So all blessings come from Christ and his obedience. All curses come from us and our disobedience. There is no other way. Our obedience will not be the thing that moves God to bless us. So there is a tension here that has to be resolved in Messiah. And so this is the tension that's presented here. And so this purging discipline is to move them to their hope. Now, this may seem like, well, this is Old Testament, and a lot of the stuff, okay, well, I could see how that a lot of this is very applicable or whatever. But let me show you how Peter uses this similar paradigm in 1 Peter, in his epistle. Peter's talking about how do you live out this time faithfully in exile. That's why he ends his book. He talks about it. We're strangers and aliens. She who is in Babylon greets you. I mean, he's using the language of exile. He refers to people kind of outside of the church as Gentile. You know, it's this picture of that we're still operating in this time of exile, even though Messiah has come and fulfilled these things. We're still waiting for these things to unfold on the earth. Listen to 1 Peter 2, 4 through 10. Listen to the temple language. And coming to him as to a living stone which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God. Psalm 118:22. And the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The laying of the foundation stone of the temple, Zechariah 3:9. The stone that has the eyes on it. In the inscriptions, Messiah embodies all of temple theology. 2:5, 1 Peter 2:5. You also are living stones. As living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So now the temple is not a physical building, but in this time of temple theology, the temple is the church. Individuals are being built. They have the Spirit within them, being built into a spiritual house of worship to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. All these things here are accomplished as well. Verse 6, for this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. That's Isaiah 28:16 and Isaiah 8:14 and 15. Verse 7, this precious value then is for you who believe, but for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone. Psalm 118:22. And a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. God in Isaiah 8, that rock. For they stumble because they are disobedient to the word, and to this doom they were appointed. Verse 9, but you, speaking of the church, are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, kingdom of priests, and a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Remember that lampstand? It's supposed to be light to the world. That's what the church does right now. The church is huge. It's monumental in God's purposes as his temple right now of what it anticipates. Now, how does Peter make application of this? Just finish with this and we'll quit here. 1 Peter 4:17. Now think about this. Remember that it represents the entrance to the temple, the house of God. For it is time for judgment to begin, house of God. Judgment starts here. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And so Peter is saying, judgment begins with the household of God, but that judgment is a discipline to get the people of God to hope in him. That's why it begins with God's household. But the judgment, if those who do not obey the gospel, if the judgment is harsh but purging of God's people, what about those who do not know God, who do not obey the gospel? The judgment for them will be even greater. And so that is a warning to turn to God. How are we to live as the temple in exile? Offer spiritual services sacrifices of worship to God through Jesus Christ as a living stone, possessing the Holy Spirit. And that's what we even come to as we worship together with Crown Valley this morning. As I quit here, just one more thing. Just wanted to give a shout out to Mrs. Vera Swenson. Just heard that you're injured. We just appreciate your continued faithfulness. We're praying for you and hope that you feel better. I assume they're watching this, but they always watch or listen faithfully, so they'll hear this at some point. But just know that we love you, we're praying for you, and that we hope to be back together again soon. Okay, so we're going to transition here to